In the college football playoff era, teams are playing more games than ever before. Well, it's actually not entirely true. Around the turn of the 20th century, schools were just doing whatever the hell they felt like it in terms of scheduling. That is why the University of Chicago appeared in 22 games in 1894. Since basically pre-World War I, though, there's been a certain uniformity when it came to college football schedules. By the 1930s, the season would begin the Saturday before Labor Day. Most schools would play anywhere between 9 and 11 contests each year. Pre-1940s, independents would sometimes play 7 or 8 games. It all sort of depended on what they could schedule. Universities lucky enough to receive a bowl invitation could then get a 12th game on their schedule. For the most part, up until 1983, a team could play no more than 12 games in any given campaign. That, of course, would change in 1983 with the advent of what would later be known as Week 0. At the time back then, they just called it preseason games, but the game still counted toward a team's record in that year. It's all a bit messy, but the takeaway is this: any team allowed to start their season a week earlier in the pre-Labor Day matchup could have themselves an extra game on their schedule for that year. So in essence, a 12th game. Around the same time, this is when the quote-unquote Hawaii rule went into effect. The regulation stipulated that any school playing a regular season contest in Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, or basically outside the continental United States could have 12 games in their season instead of 11. This was done to give those universities an extra home game, which would offset the cost involved with traveling to these places. And while it could have been used for any school wanting to play a game in Alaska or Puerto Rico, it was only ever invoked for schools visiting Hawaii. RIP Aloha Stadium. Naturally, Western Athletic Conference schools would be the ones most likely to take advantage of this exemption. What the Hawaii rule did not address was what would happen if a school also received a Week 0 waiver in the same season. This would be a loophole that would be exploited rather quickly in the 80s. The 1985 BYU Cougars just happened to have a road game in Hawaii on their schedule, meaning they were within their rights to play a 12th game. Having won the national championship in 1984, this meant the Cougars were also invited to play in the 3rd annual Kickoff Classic, the Week 0 clash played at the Meadowlands. This unlikely sequence of events saw BYU play 13 times during college football's regular season. They even received a 14th fixture, a losing effort in the Citrus Bowl to Ohio State. By my own research, which admittedly may be incorrect, this was the first time since 1913 that a school had played 14 times during a single college football season. Safe to say, a lot had certainly changed since Pop Warner was coaching that Carlisle side. The NCAA opted not to intervene, seeing this matter as nothing more than a coincidence. They would be right for the most part. It would not happen again until 1994 when Fresno State backdoored their way into 13 regular season games. They, though, did not qualify for the postseason, meaning they did not get the bowl game or game 14, and once again the issue just quietly went away. However, something happened in 1992 that would soon impact the number of games a team could play in a single season: the conference championship game. The Southeastern Conference launched their championship game, but it would be the only one in place until 1996. That is when the Big 12 and Western Athletic Conference decided to join in on the fun. This is where we find a BYU program on the ascendancy. Legendary head coach Lavelle Edwards and offensive coordinator Norm Chow had found a quarterback to execute their high-flying ambitions in Steve Sarkisian. As a junior, he led the team to a 7-4 record, but the team had a lot more on its plate in 1996. The Cougars were about to embark on the longest ever schedule concocted in modern football up until that point. Every loophole, every additional game, every way possible to nerf a schedule was to be carried out. You can't quite say these plans were completely intentional because there was just a lot of stuff outside of the Cougars' control. You can say, though, they were semi-intentional. BYU loaded up its schedule with as many games as possible, hoping that it would unlock the opportunity to play more games down the line. We start their journey with the 1996 Pigskin Classic and a showdown against number 13 Texas A&M in Provo. This was a hell of a game, albeit not exactly one that was great to watch on television. That's because fans' arms and heads keep getting into the hard cam's line of sight. When it comes to the old days of college football, there's a lot of stuff I miss, but this certainly is not one of them. Anyway, this was not the cleanest game ever played. Texas A&M fumbled 5 times, losing 2 of them, and BYU missed 2 extra points and a field goal. The Aggies rushed out to a 20-6 lead in the second quarter, but the Cougars managed to close that deficit, and the scores were level at halftime. They traded scores in the second half, and then, with a minute left in the game, Sark throws a peach to KO Kealaluhai to clinch the upset for BYU. A week later, and BYU had no issues easily dispatching a newly independent Arkansas State. That victory would see them move up to number 14 in the national rankings. After a bye week, they found themselves heading to Seattle for a showdown against a Washington team that was just... I don't even know how to describe this team. You have Corey Dillon at running back, future IWGP heavyweight champion and Japanese music sensation Bob Sapp is actually a team captain for this Huskies side. It's just such an odd collection of players here. UW was also not fancied heading into the matchup, having lost to Arizona State in their season opener. BYU, on the other hand, well, you could probably say they were a bit overconfident. In fact, there were even reports in the media that the team was bickering over what color socks they wanted to wear on this national broadcast game being shown on ABC. The color of their socks would be the last thing that mattered, as the Cougars had their asses handed to them on this day. They were down 21-7 at halftime. Sark was sacked 8 times. They actually allowed Washington to rush for almost 300 yards in what was a comprehensive defeat. The underwhelming performance carried over to game number 4 for the Cougars, as they came out flat against a very much unheralded New Mexico team with a young Gary Patterson as defensive coordinator. In fairness, the Lobos entered this matchup 3-0, but it was a program that had long been mired in mediocrity. BYU would trail at various points in this game before eventually taking a 17-14 lead that would hold up as the final score. Another home game the following week opened with BYU once again falling behind, this time to SMU 3-0. Cougar fans at this point were probably just wondering what the hell was going on with their team. Then finally the flip switched. The Cougars blitzed the Mustangs, scoring 31 straight points in the first half and cruised to a 31-3 victory. The team was 4-1 and firmly back inside the top 25. Next up was a trip to Logan and a rivalry game, a battle for the old wagon wheel, one of the more underrated college football trophies. They had no issues with Utah State in this Friday night clash. The following week, they returned home and hung 63 points against a winless UNLV side. From this point, the Cougars just continued on their roll. They would push their winning streak to 7 games all told, beating the likes of Tulsa, TCU, and UTEP along the way. A 49-0 shellacking of Rice would see BYU enter the top 10 a few days later. Next up was that trip to Hawaii for what was game number 12 on their schedule, and this again was another blowout victory for the Cougars. This set up a huge clash against Utah in the Holy War. The winner would claim the WAC Mountain Division crown, and with that came an appearance in the first ever WAC championship game. On paper, the Utes were good. They'd been ranked as high as 20th during that season. The team had also suffered some pretty bad losses to Utah State and Rice along the way. For BYU, this was just another day in the WAC office. They rushed out to a 20-0 lead early on and just simply coasted the remainder of the contest. The Cougars wrapped up their regular season 12-1 and found themselves sitting 6th in the AP poll. But as every infomercial pitchman is fond of saying, that's not all. A trip to the inaugural WAC championship game would see BYU tie the record it set for number of games played in a single season. It also had the opportunity to tie the school's single season record for victories. Standing in their way was a 10-1 Wyoming team that was ranked 20th in the country. They were led by soon-to-be Fred Biletnikoff award-winning wide receiver Marcus Harris. This game, though, wasn't simply about winning a WAC championship. There were a lot of bowl game shenanigans at play. The WAC itself had 2 bowl tie-ins. There was the Holiday Bowl and the Copper Bowl. The latter made it known they were taking BYU if the Cougars lost, and if the Cougars won, they wanted Utah. Even with 10 wins, The Copper Bowl had let it be known Wyoming was not welcome to the party. Basically, this meant they had to win the WAC Conference Championship game and secure the conference's official tie-in with the Holiday Bowl to play in the postseason. For BYU, it had something at stake as well. There was a chance a victory in the WAC Conference Championship game meant it would finally play in one of the so-called Alliance Bowls, with the Fiesta Bowl even being mentioned by players. The stakes were high, and the game certainly delivered. One of the best games in WAC history, probably one of the better games in the history of college football out west. BYU took a 13-0 lead into halftime, but a brutal injury to All-American tight end Itula Mealy in the first half had a profound impact on the team. He was a team leader. He was really just a huge part of what BYU did on offense, and players have since said losing him just caused them to lose focus as they went into the second half. Wyoming scored 17 straight points to take the lead in the fourth quarter. BYU responded with a Sarkisian touchdown pass to go up by 3. With less than 10 minutes remaining, Wyoming went ahead once more and then tacked on just about the luckiest 2-point conversion you will ever see. A botched snap meant kicker Corey Weedle picked up the ball and lobbed a prayer to a wide open David Sarif, with the Cowboys somehow gaining a 5-point advantage with this coming off. Completely wild. The thing is, things are about to get even wilder from this point on. With time winding down, Wyoming head coach Joe Tiller opts for the intentional safety instead of punting the ball from his own end zone. This isn't even one of those moves you look back on in hindsight and say that was bad. At the time, given the scoregami involved, this decision to take a safety made no sense by Tiller. BYU actually had a chance to win the game in regulation, but a Sark checkdown pass almost sees time run out instead. The Cougars thankfully got a timeout in before time did run out, and they would kick a game-tying field goal. They went on to do the exact same thing in overtime after Wyoming couldn't score on its possession, and this clinched a 13-1 season and a chance to make history. Spare a thought here though for those Wyoming Cowboys who were absolutely screwed out of a postseason bowl bid in 1996. Utah did get that Copper Bowl invite despite an 8-4 record and not being ranked in the top 25. Even after losing the WAC championship game, Wyoming retained a place in the top 25, and with a 10-2 record, you would have thought this would have been a natural selection for some bowl somewhere in America. Alas, it was not to be. Now, the school did have some drama around it with Joe Teller heading to Purdue, but this is just a patently unfair decision on the school. BYU would also find itself disappointed when the Bowl Alliance passed on them in favor of a 2-loss Nebraska team that had lost to Texas in the first ever Big 12 championship game. Oh yeah, somehow Penn State, the third-ranked team in the Big Ten, also found itself in an Alliance Bowl. BYU, for its part, had more wins, fewer losses, and was ranked higher than both participants in the Fiesta Bowl. Suffice to say, it was all pretty stupid. However, they did not have time to rue what could have been, because the Cougars had a date with history. After some cajoling and backroom dealings, BYU would receive an invite from the Cotton Bowl, who traded their Pac-12 slot to the Holiday Bowl, which would see that conference's second place team, who was ironically Washington, the only school managed to beat BYU, play there. At the Cotton Bowl, Kansas State stood between BYU and becoming the first team in 93 years to have won 14 games in a single college football season. Better yet, they would be the first program to have won 14 games without needing to play high schools. That's right, Minnesota won 14 games in 1903, but 3 of their games against local high schools counted in the official records. Good job, Golden Gophers. You show those high schoolers who's boss. Look, I know 1903 was a different time in college football, but still, these games should not count in official records, but I digress. The Cougars started the Cotton Bowl the same way they ended regulation in the WAC championship game, by scoring 5 points. Seriously, what are the odds of that happening? Kansas State then went on to score 15 unanswered points, with the game going into halftime with the very odd 15-5 scoreline. Steve Sarkisian led the team on 2 touchdown drives in the second half, and BYU went on to win the Cotton Bowl and their 14th game of the 1996 season. In an ironic twist of fate, Kansas State would be the next side to actually play 15 games in a single college football season. That took place with a few scheduling quirks that year allowing it to happen. The Wildcats, though, could only muster 11 victories. Unlike BYU, though, K-State did get that elusive Fiesta Bowl invite by winning the Big 12. Returning our attention to BYU in 1996, what a wonderfully wild season. It's a bit silly. It's one of those unconventional, not necessarily well thought out things that could only have happened in college football. It was a historic campaign for any number of reasons, and one we probably don't talk about enough to this day. On the field, they were definitely a little cocky, especially in those first few games. That loss to Washington, by the way, cost them a chance to be in contention for a national championship towards year's end. I mean, with Florida and Florida State canceling each other out, a 15-0 Cougars team would have been hard to deny, especially if they got to play in the Fiesta Bowl to secure win number 15. Alas, it'll always be one of those great college football hypotheticals we can always wonder about. What is not a hypothetical, though, is BYU's place in the history books in 1996. This side is the only school in the 20th century to play 15 games against D1 opponents in a single season, and the only one to have won 14 Division I games. No 1AA opponents, none of that shenanigans, none of that funny business. They did it the right way. Of course, all of this seems far less impressive in the college football playoff era when teams are playing 15 games and soon they're going to be playing 16 and 17 games in a season. Now we may look back on it and not necessarily appreciate what BYU did in 1996. But at a time when it took a bowl bid for most sides to reach 12 games and something out of the ordinary to play in 13, BYU managed to well and truly nerf college football scheduling. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to learn more about the BYU fullback who became a legendary NFL tight end despite not ever wanting to play tight end, video upper right hand corner of your screen. And for the story of how a hurricane and the Miami Hurricanes cost the University of Central Florida its first ever bowl invitation, video lower right hand corner. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.